Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this dissertation defense. I'm Elizabeth Allison. I'm the founder and chair of the graduate program in Ecology, Spirituality, and Religion at the California Institute of Integral Studies. And we are absolutely thrilled and proud of Chantal Forbes for reaching this point of defending her dissertation and presenting it to this assembled group. I would like to note that Chantal is the fourth doctoral student in ecology, spirituality, and religion to reach this point. So it's quite momentous. She's a trailblazer in this transdisciplinary study of ecology, spirituality, and religion. And so we're so thrilled that you can join us today to hear about her research and learn more about this field. At this point, I would like to turn it over to Jake, who is the chair of the committee.
Thanks, Elizabeth. Thanks, everybody, for joining us this morning for this really momentous occasion. Before we get to Chantal's presentation of her research, I want to take a moment to introduce the dissertation committee and then say a few words about what we're doing here today and how we'll proceed over the next hour or two. So as Elizabeth said, I'm Jacob Sherman. I'm chair of the committee. I'm professor and chair of philosophy and religion at the California Institute of Integral Studies. I taught previously at Cambridge University and King's College London, and my own work focuses in the fields of philosophy of religion, religious studies, and theology. Elizabeth Allison, who you just heard from, is a leader in the transdisciplinary field of religion and ecology. She founded the Ecology, Spirituality, and Religion program that Chantal has been working in and conducting her research in. Elizabeth studies the convergence of religion and ethics with environmental policy and practice, and she's paid particularly attention to questions of biodiversity, waste, ecological place, and climate change. In addition to being the associate professor of ecology and religion at CIIS and the founder of the ESR program, as we call it here, she also created the Religion and Ecology Summit series of annual conferences and is the co-editor of After the Death of Nature, Carolyn Merchant and the Future of Human-Nature Relations, which was just published about a year ago. Finally, for those of you who want to know more, Elizabeth has also published dozens of articles and chapters that you can go to our website and find ways to chase those things down. Her work on religious responses to climate change has been cited by various organizations, including the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. She's been in dialogue with the Earth Charter and the World Bank's Development Dialogue. We're also really privileged to have with us Professor Matthias Gunther. Matthias is Professor Emeritus in the Department of Anthropology at Wilfrid Laurier University in Waterloo, Ontario. Professor Gunther is a social cultural anthropologist specializing in the anthropology of religion, cosmology, human animal studies, and expressive culture. He engaged in over 40 or about almost 40 years of extensive ethnographic fieldwork among the Naro Bushmen, also known as the San, that is the Kalahari hunter-gatherer people of Western Botswana, about whom we'll be hearing a lot more throughout this morning. He's the author of over 100 journal articles and 6 books, including Tricksters and Tracers, Bushman, Religion and Society, and the 2-volume study Human-Animal Relationships in San and Hunter-Gatherer Cosmology. Let me just take this moment to thank Matthias and Elizabeth for all the work that they've done with Chantal up to this point. It's a truly extraordinary committee that I feel privileged to serve on. I want to say, before we hand it over to Chantal, just a few words about what we're doing, because what we're doing here this morning is something that's been done for centuries. The first doctoral degrees in Western universities were awarded over 800 years ago at the University of Paris and then Cambridge and Oxford a few years later. The doctoral degree was a terminal degree. It meant that you've progressed as far as you can go in your studies in academia. You've reached the terminus of your time as a student. You're crossing a threshold. You're now entering the community of scholars and teachers. In the Middle Ages, there were 2 different types of terminal degree. There was the master's degree, the Master of Arts, the MA, which brought the student through a full course in the trivium of grammar, logic, and rhetoric, and the quadrivium of arithmetic, geometry, music, and astronomy. After completing an MA, students could go on to further doctoral studies in divinity, law, medicine, sometimes music. And divinity was the most prestigious of these, and until the mid-14th century, could only be studied at 4 universities: Paris, Rome, Cambridge, and Oxford. To be a master, a magister, meant that you'd mastered a body of knowledge and intellectual skills, but to be a doctore meant that you'd not only mastered it, but you'd become a teacher. I'm telling you all of this to remind you of what Chantal has done and what our students in the Ecology, Spirituality, and Religion program are doing, what our Department of Philosophy and Religion is doing. All of this is in continuity with what we scholars have been trying to do for over 800 years. So there's continuity here with a tradition that exists on a scale of time that's really more geological than anthropological. Now, 8 centuries is, I should add, a scale of time that also seems somewhat small, if not trivial, compared to the endurance of the chasing hunt within human and even hominin history, a history measured in hundreds of thousands, even millions of years. We'll be hearing about that from Chantal. However it may be for anthropologists and those who study that kind of deep human history, those timelines leave me as a philosopher feeling both giddy and awestruck. So let's return to this particular ritual, the doctoral defense. What we've been doing for the last 800 years is not only awarding degrees, but also testing the candidate to see whether they can undergo the initiation and pass through the threshold, after which the title of doctor is awarded. So for the next 2 hours, we're all in a kind of liminal space, an in-between space, the space in which ritual thrives and transformation and new creation is possible. The other side of the ritual is the doctorate. Well, what does that mean? Well, doctorates are awarded in recognition of really three things: the creation and interpretation of new knowledge and original research through the candidate's own original writing, the acquisition and understanding of a substantial body of knowledge at the forefront of their own field. In this case, Chantal's working in the fields, in a broadly sort of defined field of philosophy of religion, philosophical anthropology, even a sort of comparative theology. And finally, the ability to conceptualize, design, and implement a project for the generation of new knowledge. That's what we're here to look at today. The dissertation is evidence of the candidate's capacity, of Chantal's capacity to conceptualize, design, and implement a project to generate new knowledge that will become part of the collective inheritance of human conversation, thought, speculation, and exploration of the great mysteries of the universe. It's not just a PhD defense, in other words, but a powerful moment in a conversation that's been going on for centuries, and that we hope will go on for centuries after us. The 3 of us who are involved in sitting on the committee will also be called upon to make judgments about what Chantal has accomplished. To that end, after her presentation, we'll go first, asking her a series of questions before we retire to another Zoom room to deliberate. A dissertation can be passed with no qualifications, passed with minor revisions, or the candidate can be asked to revise and resubmit. In whispers, we also acknowledge that a dissertation can fail, in which case the candidate would be awarded a terminal master's degree rather than a doctorate. All good rituals, after all, involve some real risk. But let's not dwell on the risk or on my words any longer, and instead welcome Chantal, whose important research has brought us here today. Chantal is going to be speaking to us about the primal metaphysics of becoming animal during the chasing hunt in the Kalahari Desert. A truly exciting piece of research. And so at this point, I want to turn it over to Chantal as we commence with the dissertation defense.
Thank you, Jake, so much for your beautiful introduction. I really appreciate it. Welcome, friends, mentors, colleagues, and family. I'd really like to thank every one of you for being here today, most of whom have played an integral part in me getting to this point from my first day of entering into this program 4 years and 4 months ago. My name, as you are aware, is Chantal Noah Forbes, and I entered this program as Chantal Yazbek. I was born in the central part of South Africa to mixed immigrant and settler families of varying ethnic descent. And with this in mind, I'd first just like to take a moment to thank the people whose land allowed me to do this research, the Ramayana people of San Francisco in the Bay Area, where I first conceived of the idea of this dissertation, as well as the Ute tribal people whose land I spent many days on writing this dissertation. I'd also like to thank all the tribes and peoples of my own land of birth, South Africa, and I'd like to pay specific homage to all those who identify as San Bushmen, or Khoisan peoples, and I'd like to honor them as our collective ancestors. So I'm going to start by sharing a presentation here with you, and I'm going to cut at 2 points in the presentation to show you a video. Zoom does lag from time to time with video, so I do apologize for this ahead of time. So welcome everyone here today. I would like to also recognize the various relationships that have gotten me to this point and this dissertation. And in doing this, I'd first like to thank Craig, Damon, and Lauren Foster for their patience and support in getting me materials in order to do this dissertation. And I'd also like to thank Jody O'Connor, who I see is on the call here today, for supporting me as an international student. And I'd like to thank the Anthropology and Social Change Department for being my academic family in the 4 years that I spent at CIES. Doing a PhD requires a lot of personal and financial support. And for this, I'd like to thank my own families, the Yazbeks, the Martins, and the Forbes family, particularly Charles Forbes, my husband, who's been with me throughout my program and my time here. And I'd like to honor my other than human friends and companions, Dude and Gibson, who were with me most days when I was writing my dissertation. And Gibson is lying behind me on the bed there today. So my dissertation is entitled The Primal Metaphysics of Becoming Animal During the Chasing Hunt in the Kalahari Desert. And this dissertation inquiry is a philosophical reading of hunter-gatherer perspectives on the mutability of ontological boundaries between humans and other than humans in Southern Africa. It explores how the cosmologies and epistemologies of the San Bushmen reinforce ontological ambiguity through a study of a particular form of hunting called the chasing hunt. Through a philosophical and theoretical comparative analysis, my inquiry aims to bring the metaphysics of the chasing hunt into conversation with the study of religion and ecology. In this analysis, I demonstrate that the chasing hunt occurs through a somatic reading of one's ecological environment that results in the hunter becoming a part of that environment. I interpret this process of becoming as a primal form of eco-religious ritual practice called eco-exegesis. Now, I recognize that the physical and psychological world of this inquiry is almost entirely foreign to many here today. Given this, I'd like to begin this defense with a short audiovisual clip from the film The Great Dance, made in 2000 by Craig and Damon Foster. And I'm doing this for two reasons. First, to allow some of the voices in my dissertation to introduce themselves and the world of the hunt, and also just to situate you within the broader context of Southern Africa. And if someone can just give me a shout as I begin playing the video if you do not hear the sound.
A story is like the wind. It comes floating from a far-off place. We are Son Bushmen, the sons and daughters of the first people. I Ngate live in the Kalahari. I know all the waterholes and pens around here. All the places where the animals come. When it is the rainy time, the animals come close again and fruits grow. If it rained more often, this Kalahari would always hold plenty of food. But sometimes a year will pass with no rain at all. I am a hunter. I hunt with my friends Twasa the bow hunter and Karoha the runner, who will even risk death in the most difficult of all hunts, the hunt by running. We know trekking. This is what we are born to do. We talk silently with our hands, and we read the animal stories. Trekking is like dancing because your body is happy. It is telling you that hunting will be good. Only on a very hot day can we hunt by running. We try to chase the animal to its death. We can run down Eland. We can run down Kudu. We can run down Gemsbok. Even if we see a springbok, we go after that one. Many times the animal is too fast, and we must leave it. That one wasn't meant for us to take. But sometimes our God, Pisabolo, says, I will set one aside for you. And we wait to feel in our bodies when we will be lacking.
Okay, so that is an introduction to the chasing hunt. Apologies for being slow on the technical here. I think I was a bit ambitious trying to manage two computers and a video. Okay, so the chasing hunt, as the film The Great Dance refers to it, is also commonly referred to as persistence hunting in CN Anthropology. The term refers to a form of hunting where the hunter runs after or chases an animal by tracking it at the heat of the day. Following several hours, the animal tires and overheats and can no longer outrun the hunter, which is why it's called the hunt by running or the hunt to the death. This form of hunting requires physical, emotional, and mental preparation on behalf of the hunter, whose consciousness during the hunt converges with that of the hunted other. The hunter becomes animal. I argue that at the foundation of this becoming animal is a primal form of metaphysics that supports the experience of ontological ambiguity by embracing ritual acts that foster ontological mutability. Why is this important to the field of religion and ecology? Because, as I argue, this contra-normative perspective supports a multi-species metaphysics that can assist the modern and postmodern human to build stronger relations with the other than human world, something desperately needed during times of ecological and environmental duress. So who are the San Bushmen? And I'd like to just give you an introduction to the San within the context of Southern Africa. So following an academic scientific discovery in 2011, The San and Khoisan peoples are believed to represent the genetic origins of the human family web, meaning the San Bushmen are scientifically considered to be the first peoples of all peoples currently residing on this planet. Archaeological studies done in the coastal caves of South Africa indicate that the San's ancestors were capable of symbolic thinking as early as 120,000 years ago, if not earlier. Anthropological studies on this of contemporary societies have also demonstrated that the San have resided in the Kalahari Desert for more than 40,000 years. Despite being a harsh and dry environment, the Kalahari is itself one of the most biodiverse places on the planet. The ecological heritage of the peoples who inhabited this environment for tens of thousands of years is arguably unparalleled today. San Bushmen, who are considered hunter-gatherers, and Khoisan peoples who are semi-pastoral, first encountered settlers in the late 1600s when the Dutch established a colony on the peninsula of the Western Cape of what is now South Africa. In the 400 years since then, varying San societies and communities have experienced genocide, slavery, forced removals from land, and prohibitions on traditional forms of hunting and gathering. My analysis encompasses several filmographies and ethnographies that cover a variety of San communities, mainly spanning 4 modern states in Southern Africa. These include South Africa, Lesotho, Botswana, and Namibia. In this image of Southern Africa, I've noted some of the San groupings of peoples who are represented in my inquiry according to geographical location of residence. The colonial histories of each of these states is unique, and the implications of these on San communities differs greatly. Some of the communities represented in this inquiry were completely wiped out by the middle of the 20th century. For example, the Kham in South Africa. Others, like the Djukosi in Namibia, experienced relative, if not full autonomy and little to no contact with modernity until the 1950s. With limited exceptions, the persistence or chasing hunt is no longer possible due to the San being removed from ancestral lands and due to a variety of hunting bans that support commercial agriculture, the creation of wildlife game reserves, or corporate mining operations. For each community, the situation differs vastly from country to country. And it's important to note as well that although San and Khoisan peoples broadly share comparable religious, cosmological, and ritual practices, these groups are not culturally nor linguistically homogeneous, even if they are genetically linked. Additionally, the unique encounters of different hunter-gatherer societies with the semi-pastoral Khoisan, Bantu pastoralists, missionaries, and present-day Bantu-speaking governments has resulted in a diverse evolution of San religious belief. Lastly, I'd like to recognize that the words San and Bushman are both foreign language words applied to these groupings of people who until modernity had no collective term for themselves. Despite the colonial histories of these terms, San and Bushman and San Bushmen are terms that have been actively adopted by former hunter-gatherer communities who wish to identify themselves collectively as descendants of the original hunter-gatherer custodians of Southern Africa. So what are the key thematic objectives of this dissertation inquiry? I'm going to go through 7 key thematic objectives and 4 theoretical objectives. The first is to apply a decolonial interpretation to the understanding of a primal metaphysics, the definition of which I broadly apply to the metaphysics of hunter-gatherer societies in South Southern Africa. So I'm not defining primal metaphysics, for example, within South America or for other hunter-gatherer communities. This is specific to Southern Africa. The second is to philosophically inquire about the role that San Bushman religious practices, cosmologies, and epistemologies play in the formation of hunter-gatherer perspectives on ontological mutability. And this is to better understand the role that ontological ambiguity, mutability, and fluidity play in the practice of becoming animal during the chasing hunt. Fourth, to better understand how the ritualization of becoming an animal reinforces the San Bushman's environmental heritage, and to define how the practice of becoming and becoming animal reinforces relational ontology between humans and other than humans. My desire to do this comes from a desire to value the position of human-animal relations in hunter-gatherer cosmology and epistemology, and the impact these have on their ecological worldview. And this is important, I believe, because I feel that this is something that we can all contemplate as it relates to our current ecological moment. My theoretical objectives are fewer and slightly simpler. The first is to bring the metaphysics of the chasing hunt into conversation with the study of religion and ecology by privileging the religious, cosmological, and ritualized aspects of the hunt. And here I'd just like to point out that the San Bushmen are one of the most highly studied groups of hunter-gatherers on the planet today. But for decades, their social and economic benefits of their lifestyle was where a lot of anthropologists put their attention. And so in this dissertation, I'm choosing to privilege the religious, cosmological, and ritualized aspects of their lifestyle. My second theoretical objective is to better understand how San ontology and San animism relate to the study of Euro-American process relational ontology, indigenous-centered relational ontology, animistic relational ontology, and new animism studies. So in short, what is the relationship between the relational ontology of these different traditions? Third, to define the ritualized process of becoming animal as a somatically centered eco-religious practice called eco-exegesis. And fourth, to increase the academic scope of film analysis in religion and ecology by drawing on the rich body of film materials generated by the Foster brothers as philosophical filmographic resources. I did my undergrad in film production, and film has been a strong part of my entire academic career, including through my master's. And it is, in fact, this film that I decided to study in this dissertation that Craig and Damon Foster first showed to my film class in my second week of film school. And following a Brian Swim class on cosmological powers, the film made its way back to my consciousness and into this work. So my overarching method was inspired by Begela Chilese's work in Indigenous research methodologies. And I spent a lot of time looking at different scholars' interpretation of decolonial research paradigms and Indigenous research methodologies, not because I am Indigenous, but because my inquiry is about an Indigenous peoples, and because as a white scholar from Africa, I wanted to use a theory that was also native to my own place of birth, which is why I chose to work with Chilese's interpretations of Indigenous research methodologies as a Botswanan Bantu scholar. So my overarching method is to engage with an African-centered decolonial indigenous research paradigm that privileges relational ontology within the cross-cultural context of the comparative study of religion and ecology. And this African-centered paradigm is one that emphasizes interconnectedness between beings and emphasizes the relationship between humans and other than humans. As the famous African proverb states, I am because you are. And this dissertation is very much about how identity between species helps us to better know ourselves and helps us to better form relationships with the world around us. So I work a lot, as you may have already noted, with the term relational ontology from different cultural perspectives. And so I'm just going to give a basic working definition of this term in order to frame the rest of my discussion. And so here I use Gloria Schwab's definition of relational ontology that states that relational ontology is a philosophical position that what distinguishes subject from subject, subject from object, or object from object is mutual relation rather than substance. My methodological approaches are inspired again by Chaliza and many other indigenous scholars in their use of story work and storytelling as an active method to engage the inquiry of cosmological and ritualized practices. So there's three main approaches that I take to this specific inquiry. The first is a mixed method approach from religion and ecology, which is to retrieve, reevaluate, and reinterpret narratives about the hunt found in San ethnographies, folklore, and filmographies. The second is that I drew from therapists and anthropologists Bradford and Hilary Keeney's a recursive frame analysis, which is a qualitative research method that they used in order to map and track change-oriented conversation that they applied to San Bushman ritual and storytelling. And this analysis was partly built off Keeney's study with Gregory Batterson. And then the third methodological approach that I use is to employ Matthias Günther's framing of his three ontological domains of being and the way that these represent themselves in San Bushman cosmology through stories and storytelling. And I'll explain what these ontological domains of being are in a moment. So the sources that I used for this inquiry were vast. This inquiry is a comparative philosophical reading that required a lot of theoretical and philosophical research from 4 separate areas. And so the first area was San Bushman anthropology and filmographies. As I already noted, this is one of the most widely studied group of hunter-gatherers on the planet. And there's endless amounts of material that one can spend one's time with. I worked quite a lot with the 19th century Cum archives, which is over 12,000 pages of archives. But I worked with these archives as a form of storytelling. And I worked with San rock art scholars. I worked with ethnographers from different San groups in Namibia and Botswana with the work of these. I also worked with people like Tiascanis, who are studying other hunter-gatherers in Tanzania. And then I worked with Craig and Damon Foster's films quite extensively. This is not a full list of the people I drew from. This is just an example of some of the anthropologists whose work I drew from. It may or may not go without saying, but I drew quite heavily from Matthias Günther's work as well, particularly due to the fact that his most recent work focuses on human-animal relations in San cosmology. The second group of literature that I drew from was literature that directly supported my understanding of Deleuzian and Deleuzo-Guattarian literature. So alongside trying to gain a better understanding of various European perspectives on relational ontologies. As someone who is partly of European descent, born in Africa, it was important for me to work with a European lineage of process relational ontology as well, in order to reclaim that history for myself. The third set of sources that I worked with was from new animism studies on human-animal relations amongst hunter-gatherers specifically, as well as indigenous perspectives on relational ontologies. And here I worked with the traditional canon of new animism studies, as well as working with the works of a number of indigenous scholars who work with how to use relational, or how to use story work and how to use storytelling in order to build relational ontology. And my fourth and last set of sources were eco-theological sources that support the idea of indigenous ritual practice as eco-religious practice. And here I worked with a small handful of religious scholars and also used San anthropology, as well as using other indigenous scholars, again, who spoke more to eco-religious principles. And I just wanted to highlight here Matthias Günther's most recent double volume, Human-Animal Relationships in San and Hunter-Gatherer Cosmology. And the reason I'm taking the time to highlight this is when I started this research, I was very attracted by the idea to bring San ontology into conversation with Deleuze and Guattari's theories of becoming animal. And I didn't really know how to do this because no one had really framed San ontology within the broader context of new animism studies. And so this volume of work where Matthias looks at a variety of forms of interrelationships, of transformation, of mutation, of identities between humans and animals amongst the San. This work really gave me the basis to place my own work also within the broader context of new animism studies. So there's a number of key academic theories and concepts that I use in this dissertation. There's a large handful actually, but I'm just going to list 4 categories, and then I'm going to focus on 4 specific terms that I think are important for this audience to understand, or to understand how I'm interpreting these terms. So there's key concepts that I use that are common to San anthropology, terms developed specifically by Günther, interpretations of key concepts in San anthropology by Keeney and Keeney, philosophical concepts by Giles Deleuze and Felix Guattari, and then a comparative religious discussion on primal religion by religious scholar Arvind Sharma. So in San anthropology, I'm just going to highlight 3 specific concepts. The one is primal time. And primal time is also deeply connected to first creation. Within Son cosmology, we have a beautiful interplay between time and space that is non-linear. And so primal time was a pre-existent period of time where there was complete ambiguity in the ontology between humans, animals, human spirits, humans, animal spirits, and gods. Primal time never ended, although the Son believe that they now exist in what is second creation, where there is more structure and more form and more presumed identity to one's ontology. And so understanding the way that Son cosmologies, rituals, and epistemologies work with first and second creation is key to understanding where they derive some of their beliefs about ontological mutability and ontological fluidity. And then num is also a key term that is defined in many different ways by different anthropologists. But for the purposes of this defense, I just wanted to note that this is a sort of a key source, all-encompassing type of essence or energy that is fundamental to life, to healing, to the continuing of life, and is present in all ritual acts. So whether that be puberty ritual rites, or whether that be during hunting, or whether that be through a healing dance that the Son undertake, they are always in pursuit of this particular type of energy. Key concepts that I draw from Matthias Günther is ontological flux. And so Günther describes this as a defining character of the animism of the San peoples. And this is largely what he explores in his latest volumes, is how this plays out in various aspects of the San world, and how this relates to other forms of animism that have, for example, been studied in South America or in Northern Europe. So San animism, a key tenet of San animism, is the fluidity of ontological ambiguity between humans and other than humans. Günther's frames this within the context of 3 ontological domains of being, which is incredibly helpful to work with. And so these domains of being are the world beyond of mythological being. So you can associate these with first creation, with primal time, even though they do still exist today. We have the here and now, so we can call that day-to-day life. We can call this, this is hunting exists within the here and now for very practical reasons as well. And then we have the liminal world of ritual. So again, these might be puberty rites, this might be hunting. I particularly argue that one can frame hunting within the context of liminal world of ritual, or this could be the healing dance, which is something that San regularly undertake as a form of physical, psychological healing and cohesive society building. In the film, The Great Dance, there is a lot of association made, and you can even tell this in the name, between the healing dance and hunting itself, and that they play with associating these two things together. The interpretations that I draw from Kini and Kini is I specifically use the way that they interpret first and second creation, because what was helpful from their work for me was in their analysis in their recursive frame analysis, they develop a process of understanding how the San physically or psychologically cross boundaries between first and second creation through liminal ritual acts. And so I use both Kini's and Günther's models together in order to frame my own analysis. And then drawing from continental and French philosophers Gilles Deleuze and Félix Guattari, central to my work are the concepts of becoming animal, the zone of proximity, and the plane of eminence. I use a lot of their terminology, and I do draw on a number of other theories in the dissertation, but I think that these three are the most critical, and these interface with the theories of Günther and Günther. And then lastly, I draw from comparative religious scholar Arvind Sharma in his discussion of primal religion. Okay, so these are the four terms that I would like that I'd like to discuss with you today. Primal metaphysics, primal religion, becoming animal, and eco-exegesis. So primal for me, on the most basic level, refers to that which comes first. So here, primal is specifically associated with the symbolic consciousness, society, culture, and religious systems that emerged during the Paleolithic era. So in archaeology, the Paleolithic era is often referred to as the prehistoric era. And why this is significant is that this then draws an association that primal religions then are those religions that came first, and that they are before the historical period of the world's great religions. Primal also signifies a type of posteriori or experienced knowledge that exhibits highly complex and evolved states of relating to other beings and to the earth through one's senses and through the body. So my inquiry seeks to reclaim an understanding of primal as both experiential and philosophical. This inquiry aims to privilege the primal cosmologies and epistemologies of Southern African peoples in order to recognize their ability to engage eco-religious practice with other beings on Earth in a postmodern era. And this is something that Craig and Damon Foster would argue most of us have lost that ability today. Primal religion then is a term that Sharma applies to a body of spiritual and cosmological traditions that fall outside the scholarly framework of the world's so-called great religions. He places particular focus on scholars' classification of literate versus non-literate traditions. And in this case, we're talking about a so-called non-literate tradition, so-called prehistoric, before the written word or language came into being. And so Sharma and a number of other scholars point out that literacy takes on many forms within the context of primal traditions, and that the way in which we define literacy within a tradition then allows that tradition to be its religious practices to be interpreted in a very particular way. And so this is important for me because I frame the art of trekking essential to the chasing hunt within the context of reading to know the land, reading to know one's environment. In my definition of primal religion, I place an additional emphasis on relationship to place and space, and also to the anti-structural or boundary-defying relationship that the San have to their religious expression. The third important term that I'd like to explore here with you today is the term becoming animal. So my basic understanding of becoming animal is that this is the concept of trans-species connection and ontological interaction inspired by a non-hierarchical or anti-genealogical theory of the botanical or biological rhizome, which Deleuze and Guattari explore in their work, 1,000 Plateaus. And in this biological rhizome, aspects are differentiated and interact with one another to form a multiplicity, which is a unified sum of individuated yet connected parts. And so that key aspect is really important here, individuated yet constant interacting with one another through relationships of movement, time, and space. And so I'll read a quote here from Deleuze and Guattari that states that to become is not to attain a form, but to find the zone of proximity, indiscernibility, or indifferentiation, where one can no longer be distinguished from a woman, an animal, or a molecule, neither imprecise nor general, but unforeseen and non-pre-existent, singularized out of a population rather than determined in a form. So following on from the above quote, I then go on further to define a zone of proximity as an intermediate realm where two or more domains of being come into close enough contact to converge with and influence one another. And so in my own dissertation, the process of the chasing hunt facilitates a zone of proximity between the hunter and the hunted, and a process of becoming takes place. In my reading of Deleuze and Guattari's work, the concept of a zone of proximity as an intermediate realm for the process of becoming is a powerful philosophical antidote, I believe, to an understanding of ontology that is determinate, static, and immovable. This antidote permits a richer metaphysical account of ecological environments as containers for indigenous knowledge and the heritage of indigenous lifeways. Lastly, I make use of, or I don't want to use the word invent, but I frame the words ecological and exegesis from a theological perspective together. And eco-exegesis for me is defined as a critical reading and assimilation of one's environment that, like the hunting ground itself, is multidimensional, engaging different physical, emotional, and mythological aspects of the hunter's body and consciousness. So on a very tangible level, at the heart of the San Bushman's ability to read their environment is the art of tracking. The phrase eco-exegesis is meant to insinuate a multidimensional reading of place that includes a somatic experience of the hyperrational and the mythical at once. So my inquiry encompasses, as I've just presented, a lot of different theories. And so I structured my dissertation into two sections. So in section one, I take a long time and many pages to explore the context of the world that my analysis takes place in, and then to explain the different theories that I'm using and why I'm using them and why I would like to bring them together. And section two of my inquiry then begins to weave these theories together prior to my analysis, during the analysis, and then in conclusion of the entire dissertation. So the actual analysis that I conducted was done on stories and ethnographies related to hunting. And I took 4 factors into account when trying to select sources. So this was the question that the scholar or researcher addressed, their ethical and methodological approach, the type of data that they collected, and its relevance to my inquiry specifically. The analysis itself occurred in 4 parts. So the first part, I employed a quantitative narrative analysis to discuss topics relating to the hunt. So I looked for language that was related to the hunt, not simply descriptions of the hunt itself. And then I tried to identify themes within that language. The second part of my analysis was a qualitative narrative analysis of the same information. And here I was trying to identify critical themes that I could actually use to analyze the film The Great Dance, as well as the film My Hunter's Heart, which is a second film made by Craig and Damon Foster 20 years after the first film. Then the third part of my analysis, again, applied a qualitative narrative analysis of these critical themes to the script and to the visuals. And then the fourth part was to synthesize all this information together. So initially I wanted to use a computer-based analysis in order to digest a lot more material. But because this is a theoretical study, which already distances me, somewhat from the subject, and this, when I first got my proposal approved, we just entered into COVID, and I knew there would be no way that I would be able to travel to South Africa at any point in my dissertation. So I determined to undertake a manual-based analysis to try and work literally and somatically with the material as much as possible. So how I framed my analysis was to bring 2 different models together. And so this was Gunther's model of the 3 domains of being, and Keeney and Keeney's model of crossing the boundaries from second to first creation. And so I first explore each of these models on their own merit and how they may relate to my inquiry. And then I identified 4 themes that I would then apply through these models to the film itself. And so these themes are relationality, transformation, hunting as ritual practice, and then the resulting primal metaphysics. And so this is the model that I ended up with, that I used to analyze the film. And so I didn't use the language of first and second creation in this model, but I used Keeney and Keeney's recurrent and recursive process of crossing boundaries from Gunther's 3 domains of being. So the world beyond of mythological being, liminal world of ritual, and here and now. And then I looked at how my themes facilitated that crossing of boundaries between these domains of being and how they influenced themes of ontological ambiguity and how they encouraged themes of ontological mutability. My conclusion was that this process actually forms an entire metaphysics within SON, cosmology, epistemology, and ontology. And so these primal metaphysics, in my conclusion, are an eco-exegesis of place. So the significance of this inquiry talks directly to my thematic and theoretical objectives. And so this particular inquiry assumes an integrated approach to the study of hunter-gatherer epistemologies and religious practices, which I still believe is mostly lacking within hunter-gatherer studies. It also looks at European philosophical thought and compares this to religious studies, relational ontology, and animism studies. And Son Bushmen practices and rituals are seldom studied in dialogue with eco-religious thought and philosophy of religion. And in general, I find that groupings from Southern Africa are rarely or seldom studied in dialogue with eco-religious thought. And so the significance of this inquiry for me is to increase that dialogue. I also believe that there's a lack of academic extension of the theory of becoming animal to studying hunter-gatherer ontology within an African-specific context, and that there's a lack of application of Arvind Sharma's theory of primal religions to Southern African and hunter-gatherer traditions. His theory has been used in North and Northwest Africa, but to my knowledge, there has been no public discussion about how the theory of primal religions may apply to Southern African hunter-gatherer traditions. And so I would just, at this point, before I go any further, I'm just going to pull up this ribbon. Okay, I'm going to stop sharing my screen just for a moment. I'd just like to do a time check quickly with Jake, because before I conclude, I would like to screen another film for everyone. So Jake, where are we on time? I see, do I have 10 minutes left or? Okay, great. So I'm going to share my screen again, and I think I've said a lot today. I'm not certain how coherent it is or not. And for some of you, I may have said too much. For some of you, I may have said too little, but hopefully if some of what I've said has sunk in, it will make a lot of sense when you watch the scene from the chasing hunt. It is a scene that is about a hunt. So if I just would like to mention that if anyone is sensitive to hunting, and then I'll say a few concluding remarks. In my dissertation, I include the entire script of this film. And so I thought it was important here, where you don't have access to that script, to show you some of the video.
The children of the rain are born. Now we can search for meat for all the families. It has been a long time since we last killed a big animal.
So
it will be very hot this day. Karoha must prepare to run. Now at last the time is right for the run to the death. The ones we are after, whose names we do not yet say aloud, were just here. The signs are fresh. They drank recently. It is their saliva. They are very close. Donka, Kudu. Now the chasing hunt begins. The big bull leaves. The herd keeps on. Half an hour goes by. Karoha runs without stopping. The first hour is past. The sun is like a fire overhead. The kudu are way ahead. He must read the tracks well. Underfoot, the sand burns like a second sun. As the second hour ends, the kudu are saying, "Who is this man? Always when we stop, he's there." Now Karoha is becoming kudu. No longer does he follow the tracks. He runs where they will run. He twists back where they will twist back. He runs among the thorns to chase them out of the shade. He drives them into the open. He does not slow down. He thinks of his family, who must eat meat. After 3 hours, he is close, but cannot see them. The day reaches the hottest. This is good. The kudu's blood will soon boil. Karoha must outrun his thirst. He is testing himself. Can I do this? Run with no bow or poison. Keep chasing with no rest. Only myself and my spears. For 4 hours he runs without stopping. The one God has set aside is dead on her feet. Now Karoha is controlling her. He looks through her eyes. He must help her to die.
Okay, I'm going to stop the video there. In the few minutes that continue after Karoha has killed the animal, he explains what it feels like physically and psychologically to become that animal and to be kudu for that moment in time. And with that in mind, I'll explain my conclusion now to this inquiry, which is, and I'm going to read this for you, our current environmental moment requires that we think together while celebrating difference. This has been a driving motivation behind the combined use of multiple theoretical perspectives in this dissertation. This work sought to bring together a multiplicity of theories that foster and promote an increased understanding of what it means to engage in multi-species relationality and to encounter zones of existence that facilitate a deep relational interaction between humans and other life forms. This inquiry's decolonial perspectives draw from the philosophical belief that reclaiming the Euro-American intellectual lineage of process relational thought is critical. And at the same time, this inquiry recognizes that process relational thought is not enough. It is equally essential for scholars of all backgrounds to begin engaging indigenous and primal expressions of animism and relational ontology. Why? Because as my inquiry has sought to demonstrate, a primal perspective of ontology embodies the memory of what it truly means to become human with the earth. San animism's gift for experiencing ontological mutability and openness to becoming is an engagement with the world that can help us think together to rebuild our relationship to Earth and its multiplicity of species. The added dimension of a primal perspective can be found in its ability to hold multiple spheres, multiple domains, and multiple worlds together through eco-religious ritual. This type of ritual reinforces an earth-centered cosmology by engaging an ontology of becoming. For many years, anthropologists and animists have focused their study of the hunt on the sovereign right of indigenous forms of survival. Now that the hunter-gatherer way of life is on the verge of extinction, several scholars are beginning to ask how the hunt served to create moral and ethical human-animal relations. In asking this question, we are just now beginning to see that in a primal world, hunting served as a zone of proximity where the cosmological expression of multiple dimensions meet, a place where the earth and all its inhabitants take on a form of sacredness. Deleuze and Guattari state that our greatest challenge now is to believe in the world again, to believe in new possibilities and to let new forms of existence emerge that are closer to animals and rocks. The task to embrace other ways of being and becoming in the world. In San animism, learning that way of being in the world is a recursive and recurrent process of transformation between ontological domains of being, between first and second creation, and between the present and the past, a process that takes place through the eco-exegesis of one's environment, through becoming with other beings. This primal form of an eco-exegesis of place, this primal metaphysics, provides modernity with a renewed set of tools for instituting a new plane of eminence in our day and age, a set of tools that may help us to engage in what the San call the great dance of life. Thank you very much for your time and for your attention today.
Thank you, Chantal, for walking us through the various components and theories and conclusions of your extraordinary research, and for sharing with us as well some of those some of the documentary images and the scenes, which I think really help to put to clothe with color and weight what you're engaging in a variety of theoretical lenses that are really important. Because we want to avoid any potential technical difficulties, and I know that we were a little concerned about that on Matthias's end, I want to invite Professor Gunther to begin with some of his questions, so that if there is any interruption, we at least have begun with Professor Gunther, and then I will ask some. Then Elizabeth and I will sort of go back and forth asking our questions. But let's begin by inviting Professor Gunther to pose some questions and engage in some dialogue with you.
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Everyone
we
hears
can.
me? Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you, Chantal, for a brilliant summary of your dissertation, a model of clarity, and the videos, of course, were exceptionally effective and beautifully done. I have basically one big question, a general question, and if there's time for the more specific ones later. And the big question I have is based on two personal experiences to which I will get later on. I have a bit of a preamble to the question, if that's okay. To contextualize this question in my own discipline, which this interdisciplinary dissertation in this interdisciplinary university has included within its purview. Now, the specific question, I had specific questions too that came up when I read the dissertation in the course of its development in its various versions. And I've gone over these with Chantal in our email and Zoom exchanges, and they've all been answered to my satisfaction. So I'm not going to go into these specific questions. Maybe they'll come up later. I should also, before going on, saying that the exchange I had with Chantal this last year is in the context of a terrific project that I appreciate, especially for the seminal way it complements my own work on Bushman cosmology, ontology, religion, and by applying it to a highly germane framework from philosophy, becoming animal as per Deleuze and Guattari, that I had not considered before. Deleuze and Guattari are marginal figures in my discipline, mentioned more or less tangentially here and there, for example, by Tim Ingold and Sean Sullivan, both of whom Chantal brings up in her dissertation. My engaging with Deleuze and Guattari, as mediated through Chantal's project, has led me to other thinkers in the field of environmental humanities, which I realize it should really be at the core of my own discipline too. And this project has made me aware of it and made me appreciate it, and led me to other writers like David Abram, Arvind Sharma, and most recently and most excitingly for me, the philosophical ethologist Dominique Lestel. I don't know if his work is known. I just discovered him literally 2 weeks ago, and I'm in the process of reading his stuff, and I'll want to bring him to Chantal's attention because the two of them, I think, are on the same wavelength. So my general question is on cross-cultural explanation or translation or dialogue, which is the dissertation's basic theme and basic objective. Now, the issues and questions, intellectual, theoretical, moral ones, that surround this enterprise of cross-cultural explanation are and have always been at the heart of sociocultural anthropology, now more than ever before, causing a double-barreled crisis in my discipline, a crisis of confidence and a crisis of representation. Is it possible, the questions are, conceptually and epistemologically, for the Western cultural outsider, an academic to boot, to get the insider's view, the indigenous perspective? Is it even permissible, this kind of undertaking, because of its inherent cultural presumptuousness and intellectual arrogance? Is it an insidious variant of colonialism, even imperialism, the two bugbears and sworn enemies of anthropology, with which its practitioners at home at university as university professors and in the field as ethnographers are in collusion, more or less unwittingly? Now, these two soul-searching, navel-gazing questions have preoccupied anthropology forever, ever since my undergraduate years, decades, centuries ago, on the possibility of acquiring the indigenous perspective. The former, on the possibility of acquiring the indigenous perspective, preoccupied anthropology in the mid-20th century. The latter question on its ethical permissibility is the question that came up at the century's end and has continued to this day ever more stridently as before. Now, before going on to my question, I would note something else about Chantal's work, and this is that she has, in fact, shown keen awareness of these issues and questions. Her dissertation has made an admirable job of relativizing and decentering the Cartesian model of the nature culture, specifically human-animal great divide, as the scholar calls it. She has given careful consideration to that paradigm's challenges, both from within and from without. The former by Deleuze and Guattari via their concepts of becoming animal, zone of proximity, and the rhizomatic trans-species connectivity. And the latter, the challenge from the outside, via CN cosmology, specifically relational cosmology, as played out in the persistence hunt. Here I would also note the aptness of the methodology used in the dissertation, a variant of indigenous methodologies focused on storytelling, as per the Botswanan scholar Bagela Chilisa and other indigenous methodologists. The dissertation forwards de Sousa Santos' Eurocentric Abyssal 9, separating northern and southern epistemologies, giving the latter, as instantiation of the Bushman of Southern Africa, the recognition and esteem it is due. Now, to my question finally, which I will frame in prose in terms of the recent personal experience that I referred to earlier. In 2019, I was actually quite close to where you guys are, at the Joint American Anthropological Association and Canadian Anthropology Society conference in Vancouver, which I attended. Now, there was an Anglo-Canadian anthropology presentation. He had just finished his paper on the mythologizing of the landscape by Northwest Coast Tlingit First Nations, with reference specifically to trickster raven place names. I thought this was a model paper, interesting, elegant, well presented, original, as evidently did others, judging by the exceptional rousing round of applause the speaker got when he finished. It was not received that way by an angry, articulate First Nations conference attendee who got up and lambasted the speaker along the above noted lines. That is, accuse him of intellectual imperialism, arrogance, presumptuousness, and so on, as well as, and especially so, lack of sensitivity and respect for desecrating the raven, an animal charged with cultural significance, which the speaker should not be privy to. After delivering her condemnation that lasted a good 10 minutes, the young woman walked out, followed by 2 or 3 other like-minded attendees. Here I note that I've had much the same experience a couple of years ago at a conference when I presented a paper on lion transformation along the academic terms that we use in symbolic anthropology. And I had much the same response from some indigenous attendees. So now, after this long and seemingly endless preamble, Chantal, my question to you. Were you ever to be in this sort of confrontational situation when presenting your project on the primal metaphysics of becoming animal during the chasing hunt in the Kalahari Desert? How would you respond to the questioner? Or just perhaps you may not expect such a confrontation, given that you have addressed and resolved these sorts of issues, as I noticed before in your dissertation, and possibly precluded this sort of reaction from an Indigenous conference attendee.
Yeah.
So maybe there will no confrontation will ensue, but using Scheimer's word, reciprocal illumination. So I'm interested in your comments. I know you've grappled with all of this in your thesis, and just like you comment some more on this, because it's such an issue in anthropology nowadays.
Mm-hmm. So thank you, Matthias, for that question. I think it's a really important question, and I'm almost certain that that will happen at some point in my career if I continue to work in this field. And it may happen rightfully so. You know, I think we can't all be appropriately sensitive all the time. We're going to make mistakes. So I think the first thing is to recognize that you're going to make mistakes and to interrogate deeply what the person is saying and where they're coming from. And if you're able to publicly apologize for misstepping, if that is appropriate in the instance. I do think we live in interesting times in the field of religion and ecology and in environmental studies and humanities overall. We're coming to the realization that a lot of the answers that we thought were answers to working in and with the earth, our environment, and with other species are not valid. And cause a lot more harm than they do good. And so there is a general tendency to seek inspiration from people who have been tending the environment for a lot longer than ourselves, and to look to them as guides and mentors. When I first came to this program, I initially wanted to work with Indigenous peoples on this continent. I abandoned that idea for a number of reasons. I very quickly realized I know nothing about Indigenous peoples on this continent. And I'm not from this continent. So even as someone who's ethnically mixed and of settler descent, my family at least traces back 400 years in South Africa. And so that is the land of my birth, I can appropriately interrogate my own colonial heritage and ancestral history in that land. And I've spent a lot of time in and amongst the spaces where the San Bushmen live, have lived, and in the places that that they called home. And so, and actually the 400-year history of my family in South Africa is in the Eastern Free State, very close to the Drakensberg Mountains, where the extinct Kham people once lived, and where they've left so much rich rock art. And I spent my entire childhood pondering and thinking about them through that rock art. So part of the answer for me was that as a non-Indigenous person, if I'm going to deal with Indigenous environmental heritage, that I should at least start from the place of my own birth and from my own country, where I'm able to deal with the cultural, racial, and political context. And so there's a lot in that. And when Elizabeth Allison was asking me a lot of different questions, I realized even more how complex the situation in South Africa is. The second thing is that I didn't want to actually use the word Indigenous as a primary word in my dissertation, because when I think of Indigenous peoples, these are living societies that exist in place today, whereas what I am trying to, and many of their customs and traditions are still active. What I'm trying to address is a way of life that for various reasons almost entirely no longer exists on planet Earth, but that all peoples, irrelevance of race or ethnicity, shared at some point in our history as Homo sapiens. And so a discussion of primal for me is a discussion of collective ancestral heritage. And I think I would like to develop this thinking and exploration a little more. And I'm not saying everyone's going to agree with me, but this is something that I learned actually specifically from Craig Foster in his search to reclaim his, what he would call his own primal somatic experience with the world. It's a way of being in the world that should be native to us all, but for various reasons and historical contexts, it is no longer so. And then lastly, you know, the San Bushmen, from a South African's perspective, are not, I wouldn't even apply the word Indigenous to them, because the many Bantu-speaking tribes and peoples that govern South Africa and are the dominant population in South Africa are the Indigenous. So the San are the undervoice that we never learnt about. It was a forbidden story, and we were told that there are no more San people in the world. And so recovering the primal, once again, is about recovering something that I feel South Africans as a whole have neglected, whether they're Indigenous or not.
Yeah, thank you. I like, very good. I think very much like you too, and my work has also been concerned with recovering the primal. You know, as Elizabeth Marshall calls it, the old way. You know, but the thing is, when I talk to contemporary San people, which I've done over 40 years, many times they don't want to hear this. You know, they say, well, we don't. And when you go to the Kalahari, you see people, you know, they butchering goats, cutting their throats, and as though they were opening a sack of potatoes, you know. So what concerns me, although I have no answer to it, because my own work has done what you're doing, and I consider it important. But there is a disconnect between what we do by recovering the old ways and where Indigenous people are at today, in that they have kind of jettisoned that. They have disassociated themselves, repudiated these ways even, They might say, oh, we're Christians, we don't no longer believe in Brahma and the trickster. So I raise this simply for discussion, not I have no answer, because my own decades of career of writing has been what you're doing, and I value what you're doing, and I would value what I've done. But oftentimes it doesn't resonate with contemporary Indigenous people. There are two solitudes here, I just wanted to bring this to your awareness, and in case you get ever ready to publish and present papers at conferences, which I'm sure you will, just make you aware that you might not get all that receptive an ear from the Indigenous people themselves.
Thank you, Matthias. I just wanted to add one point to that. Is I'd like to point out, this is why it's increasingly important for me to keep learning from the voice of Megan Beasley
Yes.
in her ongoing work, because Megan is one of the few anthropologists who have worked continuously over multiple decades with evolving communities. And her most recent work really tries to grapple with this their voice and what has changed in their voice, and recognizing, allowing them to speak for themselves. And as someone who's not an ethnographer, trained ethnographer, I try to really draw from ethnographers who were really sensitive to this point.
Megan is a role model for me here, and especially with some of the publications she's done with Indigenous, with Bushman as co-authors, very much like the example you cite from the Yukon, was it? A co-authored work with an anthropologist and an Athabascan elder. You mentioned it in your thesis. Yeah, that to me is one way of dealing with this. There's several others that I've thought about, but I think I'll turn it now to my to Jacob and Elizabeth. Yeah.
Thank you, Matthias, for those the really powerful questions, and for bringing some really important ongoing contemporary issues that all of us face when trying to talk about these sorts of things. And thanks, Chantal, for your response. Elizabeth, I realize I've spoken a fair amount already today, and I have questions that I'm eager to ask, but I want to see if you'd like to go first. I'm sure you have some questions that are ready to go there.
Sure. Yeah. Thanks, Jake, and thank you, Chantal, for that very clear and detailed presentation of one thing I have to really congratulate and highlight is the bringing together of so many disparate domains of inquiry and approaches into this really transdisciplinary work focused on a central question. And you've marshaled so much evidence from so many different fields, and I think been quite attentive to the epistemological challenges of moving between, say, anthropology and philosophy of religion and epistemology, and trying to bring these together. So want to congratulate you for that, and also really appreciate your thoughtful positioning of yourself and your social location in relation to this question of primal metaphysics and primal religion, and your response to the previous question really is evidence of your sensitivity to that. And I appreciate your commitment to continuing to learn. And as all of us scholars hopefully are, to continue to learn how to be in right relationship with primal peoples and indigenous peoples. So I think my question relates somewhat to that. In your conclusion, you propose that learning about this eco-exegesis and the primal metaphysics can provide something to the contemporary world, can provide something to modern and postmodern people. And coming from the pole of religion and ecology and environmental studies, I'm interested in the applications of this epistemological question and how it might inform environmental studies. So you unpack the metaphysics of this multi-species ontology, which I think is really helpful because we hear the term multi-species ontology in a lot of different times and places, used in a variety of ways, and you unpack the specific metaphysics here and show what's going on for the son in the chasing hunt and in that experience of becoming animal, which I found really powerful in the concluding chapter of your dissertation. And you suggest that modern people can and should learn something from and about this metaphysics. But my question is, how? And so the chasing hunt, unfortunately, is not even happening much, if at all, in Southern Africa. And to bracket another really interesting question is the role of game reserves that are supposed to preserve multi-species in relation to suppressing that chasing hunt. But we're going to bracket that for now. But if this practice is barely practiced at all, if it's an endangered practice, but if it has some global heritage of humanity that has some important insight, how do we build this bridge? So you've started to build the bridge by describing the metaphysics and opening up that space so we can even perceive something about the metaphysics. But how else can this move from a very evocative description, the very evocative Foster films, to inform our own multi-species ontologies? Because that's where I become really engaged. How are we humans engaging with our next of kin, our other species, and maintaining their presence on Earth?
Thank you, Elizabeth, for that question. And there's many things that I can say about that question. And the first thing I want to say is that the first thing that I'm asking the reader to do is to start engaging in a process of thinking differently. So whether we like it or not, unfortunately, we live in a world that's very centered on thought. And so what I'm asking the reader to do is two things. First is to think differently about the boundaries between yourself and the spaces around you and the beings around you. Recognize that there are other perspectives in the world and that those perspectives were very successful for a very long period of time, even if they no longer exist. And that our perspective that we sort of define and adopt presently is not a very old perspective. And it doesn't seem to have been incredibly successful in prolonging the lifespan of our species on planet Earth. So that is something that I'd like to do. A lot of these films, for example, did not get international release like My Octopus Teacher, which I'm so thankful that Craig was able to take that film as far as he did, because that film has the same objective as these first two films. So these films were not widely released. They were widely shown to San communities, particularly across South Africa. And to Matthias's point, what is interesting is I think that within a South African context, there is actually a revival of San traditional culture as a way of claiming individuation and identity amongst 11 other official tribes in South Africa that hold prominence and dominance. So one of the limited exceptions of where the principles of San Bushman hunting is actually being practiced is on land given back to the Kumani San in Southern Africa, where they are actually facilitating a tourist venture where traditional hunters, which are mostly often white males of settler descent, can come and learn from them about an interconnected way of hunting and connecting to the environment. So my hope is that simply by bringing voice again to this practice, that people will think differently as well about the opportunity and potential of hunting, which is still widely practiced in the world today and very, very popular, and not really associated with environmental conservation. And so in part, I'm arguing that it is actually a potential tool for environmental conservation if you engage in the practice of hunting through not only noticing, but through building relationship with what you are noticing during that process of hunting. And this is why it's important for me that there is a spiritual or religious aspect to this. Jake always sort of points out that the separation of religion and life it took place only after the Enlightenment. And so I'm arguing here that in a primal perspective, there is no separation between the liminal world of ritual, the world beyond, and the here and now. They are separate domains, but they're interconnected in a Deleuzian way that I'm trying to explain. And so engaging in that process, so even the act of engaging in hunting from that multidimensional process, I think can have a huge impact on the way that people approach their environment.
As you go, thank you, Chantal. That's great. As you continue on that line of thought about hunting and wildlife conservation, there is quite a body of literature that on both sides that contests it. I'm aware in Africa that oftentimes trophy hunting, which is obviously very, very different qualitatively, is used to sustain some parks and preserves. So it just like to move into that area, it's highly contested terrain. And it'll be really interesting to think about the primal practices of hunting or indigenous practices of hunting in that Watson and Huntington article that you cite. Similarly, in Canada, the practice of primal or indigenous forms of hunting as opposed to a modern or industrial style of hunting is quite qualitatively different. Obviously, a different and future project, I hope. So I would like to turn it over to Jake, because I realize that we're getting near the end of our time.
Thanks, Elizabeth. I have congratulations, Chantal, on getting to this point. It's been such a marvelous experience working with you on your dissertation and working with this committee on your dissertation. I echo everything that the other two committee members have already said, both about your presentation this morning and about the work you've done, which is enormously ambitious in its integration of so many disciplinary voices, but also in its integration of different people groups of different geographical regions, your effort to sort of deprovincialize a dominant North Atlantic academic voice, and to allow your engagement with the San to effect an act of a reflexive act in which your own identity and voice and perspective are become themselves are put into a certain sort of jeopardy and a certain kind of transformation. I think that's really methodologically exciting and promising. So I just wanted to point that out and to commend that. And my question comes also sort of in the wake of that. I'm condensing a number of different questions here because we're late on time, and so I'm going to try to put my whole sort of all the various questions I could ask you into one. And I think it would be this: implicit within your challenge to received Western ontologies is a moral and a spiritual claim, namely that a widening ontology might assist modern people in moving towards a wider, more robust moral universe, including both peoples that we haven't included within our moral and political universe on equal footing previously, and other species, other members of the Earth community. And I guess my question has to do with how much we can actually expect ontology to do that. So like, I guess what I'm trying to say is if shifting the metaphysical discussion, if shifting our metaphysical priors is just the running of a sort of new, running an updated software or whatever, right? This is not language I like, but I'm trying to present it in the sort of baldest possible way. If it's just sort of shifting our theoretical perspectives, how does that change our actual relationships? And I heard this implicit in both Matthias's question and Elizabeth's in some ways. And the other side of my question would be, is it a question of changing? You talk about thinking differently. Is it a question of changing what we think? Or is it a question also of changing how we think, the very process of thinking? That Deleuze quote that you referenced during your presentation, the one about becoming, if I remember correctly, that about becoming involving these zones of proximities and the sort of sheer individualities of affect and stuff. If I remember correctly, Deleuze was writing about the very process of writing there. So he was talking not just about something that's out there ontologically in the world, that we establish these zones of proximities in which becomings and becomings animal are possible, as it clearly is in the hunt that you're studying. But also he seemed to think there was something that could be done in scholarship, in writing, in thinking, that involves that same sort of not just shifting to a different script, not just an armchair philosophical shift of what I think about the world, but something more substantive that was at risk in the very task of doing philosophy, so that we move from thinking about to ourselves being transformed, and thinking being the sort of thinking being in some sense what's created through that transformation. So those are a number of different thoughts. I think there's a kind of question in there that has to do with the adequacy of shifting theories and shifting ontologies, and what else is required above and beyond that. And maybe as a writer, what kind of a challenge does that present to creating a dialogue with the academy more widely?
Thank you, Jake. So first I want to say, I don't think it's about what we think at all, because I don't believe we should be trying to tell anyone what to think or prescribing what to think. It's about re-engineering the process of how we think to a greater level of complexity. And so one way to sort of describe this is that I don't think ontology does have limits and philosophy has limits, which is partly why it was so important for me to bring these different things together. So if I return back to Matthias's 3 domains of being, it's about being able to hold the complexity of multiple things together, which is something that we're entirely trained not to do. We don't actually have the tools to do this anymore. And Pierre Duplessis, a recent PhD graduate, someone who defended in 2018, who worked with the same CN Bushmen that are represented in the film The Great Dance, at a time where hunting was no longer possible, he did a study that in some ways had some similar objectives to mine on the art of tracking and how tracking affects a different way of seeing the world and thinking in the world. So you have these very literal somatic acts that have been used for tens, if not hundreds of thousands of years for humans to simply survive. And what we're learning now on a very scientific level is that engaging in those practices, these physical practices, trains the brain to be able to hold multiple spheres together and trains the brain to think differently. And so from my perspective, this is the objective. We still have this like literal challenge of how do we do this, living the lives that we live without engaging in pseudo inappropriate practices of appropriation, you know, so all getting on safari now and taking a 1-week course from who knows by who, that's not necessarily achieving that goal, which is then why we come back to it also being a philosophical problem at the same time. I think that you know, Thomas Berry and Brian Swim grappled with this problem a lot in their understanding that we need a new cosmology, that we need a new story, because what was really important for me when I looked at this work is that, and as Matthias has pointed out too in his work, is that the San have been praised for being the most effective survivors over long periods of time in very difficult and harsh environments. But our belief is that that's not the only thing that helped them to survive. It was their engagement with cosmology. It was their embrace of mythology. So their embrace, like I said, of the irrational, of the unexplainable, of the unseeable, that reinforced their ability to practically function effectively in the world. So I would really say that, you know, for me, ontology goes nowhere in some ways without mythology and without cosmology. And so the more I read from the San, it's their mythology that is constantly reinforcing their ways of being in the world. And even despite the challenges that Matthias has stated, we had this interesting discussion about the words that Nati says at the beginning of the film, where he says stories are like the wind. And Matthias says, well, this is the words of Cabo, who was a cum informant. You know, in the 19th century, these words were written down in the Bleak and Lloyd archives more than 100 years ago. And I am convinced, because I even spoke to Craig about this, not he himself does not know that those are Cabo's words. That these words weave their way through mythology and common understandings of cosmology into the narratives that San, you know, continue to tell themselves. So we do think it's about building complexity. And lastly, what I'd like to say is that really only now, I mean, like in the last 2 decades, we're beginning to learn scientifically that our understanding of our ontology is in some ways entirely flawed. You know, so if you look at the way complexity science is redefining individuated form and species, I think that eventually that will match, and I talk a little bit about how that matches what Deleuze and Guattari were writing about. And this is why I so dearly wanted to work with Deleuze and Guattari's work, because it was and is my intuition that this is exactly what they're trying to do. They are trying to challenge us to re-engineer the way we think.
Thank you. Thanks. That your point about mythology and story, I think, is really important here. In that, as mythopoetic and storied beings, we imagine ourselves not just hearing or the receivers of stories, but also carrying them on. So there's a kind of dramatic and participatory task always involved in orienting ourselves to a story, which is wonderful. I recognize that the hour is getting late, so I want to ask the other committee members if they have any additional questions or comments they'd like to make before we retire into our private room for deliberation. No? Okay. Then Shmi, can I ask you to put us into a little room, just the three of us? And during this time, the rest of you can have a chance to talk with Chantal.
And Matthias, you should see a pop-up, little window pop-up that invites you to join a breakout room.
Okay, join.
Success.
Yay,
Yes, congratulations, Chantal.
Chantal. Congratulations.
Hi, Talia.
Woohoo!
Sorry for the technical difficulties. I got so overwhelmed with the screens, and then you click on the presentation and the Zoom disappears, and then and then I'm sitting there and I'm like, oh my gosh, it's too much going on technically.
Oh, that, I don't know, may I speak? I just started speaking, so you guys, okay. I wanted to, well, first congratulate you.
Thank you, my dear.
Wonderful, wonderful.
Thank you for being here.
Absolutely, absolutely. Read the acknowledgement in my dissertation. You're in there. I thank you from the bottom of my heart for all your help during that time for me. So I had to show solidarity, of course, and because you're a lovely, incredible human being, and you deserve support all the way through. I do have a question, and I'm wondering what you think about this. I guess thinking more like anthropology and social change, which were also your family, as you said. How much of, like, for example, the use of the word hunt, right, as having a historical, or the etymology stemming from the Western world, that, you know, that Old English Germanic roots. Like, how much of that do you think fully really describes this practice that you're talking about? And the reason why they came up, this question surfaces because I remember also during how the history of how Two-Spirit came up in conversation with Indigenous communities, where after the horrific event of a particular murder of an Indigenous person, the term LGBT or gay, which is what we use here, wasn't enough. And the Indigenous community said, no, we have this practice, so we get to define it, right? The Indigenous community got to define that practice. And so I was thinking about that and thinking about this and your work and how important it is. And I'm wondering how much the Western term hunt limits the work. And number two, if being in direct conversation with them, I guess this would be like the ethnographic piece. Like if there's actually a truer word, you know, to use to describe the practice. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, that does make sense. And I haven't come across a true word for the simple word hunt, because what you're pointing to is there are multiple forms of hunting even within San society. And they view hunting in many different ways. So there's a scene in this film, there's three hunters, you know, that are sort of traveling together. They spend most of their days together, they track. One is a bow hunter, and only one is the runner. So way back when, a chasing hunt was a rite of passage that you had to achieve as a puberty rite, as a male, in order to sort of, before you can, you know, become someone who can be wed, or before you can become an official hunter for the community. And the reason for that is because there's a lot of ritual, a lot of taboos, a lot of do's and don'ts and rules around the chasing hunt, which I, you know, didn't have time to go into. And that governs the attitude of the hunter. It governs sort of enforcing humility upon the hunter. So, for example, the bow and the arrow that the hunter uses are not his own. This belongs to an elderly woman or a small child in the community. The meat does not belong to him when he comes back. When he returns, the women make jokes at him and tell him what a fool he was and that he didn't do anything. So there's all these customs to institute a certain way of relating to that hunting. On the flip side, there's simple bow and arrow hunting, or simple spearing of small animals as a practical form of, you know, we need to just continue to feed ourselves with basic amounts of meat. And so they refer to those as hunting, but the hunt to the death, for example, as you heard them refer to it, the running hunt, has an entirely different connotation to it. And this is why I chose to discuss this particular form of hunting, is because I'm fully aware that a lot of hunting is purely practical and meant for mere survival purposes. But there are specific forms of hunting which shape our psychology in a different way. And that's what I was more interested in exploring. I see Shmi says, I don't know if Shmi says that the committee is rejoining, or yes.
Are we all back? Let's see. I see Elizabeth and Matthias. Great. Well, sorry to interrupt things, everybody, but we had a nice little deliberation back there, and it wasn't a very difficult decision for us. We we're all in accord that Chantal deserves to be passed without revisions. This is a fantastic dissertation, and you performed just wonderfully today, Chantal, with grace and poise and knowledge and about really important matters. And you've conducted a really important work of research and writing that we're eager to see where it goes in the future. So with that said, let me be the first to congratulate you and say welcome to the community of scholars, Dr. Forbes.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Congratulations.
So yes, everybody, we all have the chance to congratulate Chantal at this point.
And Jake, I'd really like to thank yourself and Elizabeth and Matthias for all the time and dedication that you gave to this dissertation and this work, and for your openness to allowing me to take on this challenge. And I was in part able to do this because of your own broad understanding of philosophy and even your own understanding of anthropology. So thank you for that. And I'd also just particularly like to thank Matthias for the large amount of time that he afforded me to mentor me in the field of CN Bushman anthropological studies. He was very patient with me and afforded me many hours of discussion and many readings of my various iterations of the dissertation. So thank you. And to my chair, Elizabeth, for guiding me throughout this process and for really spearheading this department that I know will continue to grow in the future.
Well, thank you, Chantal. It's been a privilege. I know we've all enjoyed it deeply and have learned a tremendous amount along the way. At least I have.
I'm so proud, Chantal, that our fourth doctorate in ecology, spirituality, and religion focuses on Africa and focuses on primal and indigenous people. It's such an important contribution that you've made to the field of religion and ecology, and particularly to our ecology, spirituality, and religion program, showing where our priorities are and that we are actively working to decenter the white Eurocentric perspective. I was speaking with Jake yesterday, and we were talking about how important beginnings are. And I think it's just profoundly important that within the first 5 doctoral graduates of this program, we have focused on the continent of Africa. And it's just like so important to global future, truly. So thank you.
Well, I also know that we've gone over time a bit. Some of us have other commitments coming up fairly soon. Chantal, Shmi, is this room open for a while? Is that?
Yes, we have some time here. Mm-hmm.
Okay, well, that's wonderful. So Chantal and all those who are in attendance, you're welcome to stay here and continue the discussion. And some of us will have to leave pretty shortly, but I know we might have, because of the brevity of our deliberation, those of you who were talking with Chantal while we were away might have gotten cut off by our sudden return. But
I just want to say, Chantal, I enjoyed working with you on your project very, very much, and I learned a lot, and it's opened new vistas. I'm already exploring new ideas for new projects, thanks to what you led me to, through your work. Yeah, I thank you very much, and I would say this is really if we weren't we were together in the same space, it'd be time to open a bottle of Cape wine, right? And, and say cheers. And I would say, especially Nederburg. I recommend that one. Yeah, that's a good one. the Sauvignon Blanc. Okay. I need to go now, and because I have to walk the dog. And well, we'll be in touch. We'll stay in touch, I'm sure. Okay.
Thank you so much.
Bye. Bye, everybody.
Bye, Matthias.
Bye.
I think Elizabeth and I are going to be signing off too as well, Chantal, but congratulations. I wish we were there. We were all together in one place to celebrate, just as Matthias suggested, and I hope that we'll have a chance at some point to do so.
Yes, thank you, Jake. Thank you.
Congratulations.
Congratulations, Dr. Forbes. I have to sign off, but just thrilled for your success.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Bye.
absolutely.
Thank you,
Great
Jake.
job today. Thanks, Elizabeth.
Great. Yeah.
I'm going to go to congratulations, Dr. Forbes.
Bye, Talia. Thank you so much.
Thank you, friend, colleague, and we'll be in touch, hopefully, and celebrate. Ciao.
Hi, Kim.
Hi, Chantal. Congratulations, Dr. Forbes.
Thank you. Thank you so much for coming today. That's like, I forgot to thank all the people I was supposed to thank. And it's like, I wanted to mention that my program coordinator, now professor, was here. So
yeah. No, I was happy to not be mentioned, to forefront all the other important people who have helped you so much. It's so exciting to hear your work, because I feel like I've gotten little pieces here and there. So just to get a whole overview was just such a pleasure. It was really great. I really appreciate it. I have questions. I have to go. I'm not sure what anybody else is.
Well, if you would like to ask a question because you have to go, please go ahead. I wanted you to be able to ask a question.
Okay. Well, one's just a clarification question, and I think you might have covered it in your talk, but I just want to clarify. So is the run hunt, the one that you focused on, that's categorically different from like hunting small animals for survival? Would this be categorized, and this is kind of like a Western concept, but would it be more of like a rite of passage?
Yeah, definitely. First, the only reason you engage in such a hunt is to hunt a really large animal. So this is most of the time a large antelope. And this is a very dangerous and difficult hunt. So it's not something that's practiced every week or every month. So it's practiced. But however, when you do hunt in this manner and you do catch a really large kudu or eland, for example, you can feed an entire band of people for more than 2 months. So there's these different layers of significance that are brought to this type of hunting. Not all hunters can practice this hunt. So in other words, even though traditionally all hunters had to undertake such a hunt as a rite of passage to become a man, they would then take on the form of hunting that suited them best. So Elizabeth Marshall Thomas talks about, the hunter that has a limp, for example, is not going to be the running hunter. Or so there's different forms of identity that hunters can take on to serve different needs within the community. And so, and as I was sort of saying to Talia, because this is the most prized and most skilled form of hunting, there's a lot of emphasis put on putting the hunter down, so to speak. So in order to ensure that the hunter doesn't see himself as higher within what is really traditionally a very egalitarian society.
Well, that was a good end of the, yeah, because as you're guiding into the like masculine rite of passage, you led me in that more questions, and then you answered to kind of tie it back that doesn't necessarily mean that you're intrinsically better, which I think in the West, that's where it goes, right? Which creates that sort of patriarchal hierarchy. So it is almost like the trickster part, like the jokes and the kind of keeping the humility there is also part of the ritual, which is ties to the relational ontology then, right?
Yeah, and what I mentioned in my dissertation, which is important to mention, and Megan Beasley mentions this a lot, she focused a lot on the practices of the women, is that all women know how to track too. So women are the ones spending the majority of the day out in the field gathering. They actually collect 80% of the food for the community. And so they will often come back and tell the men, this, we saw these tracks, we saw those tracks. You know, they have this tradition of storytelling around the fire, and something that's very much a part of San cosmology and mythology is telling stories about animals and how the animals move and behave in their different environments. So the women are very much a part of this process, even though there are very practical reasons why females do different things to men. And a lot of that has to do with child rearing and childbearing. But yeah, it's not like, so the male as hunter should also not be privileged from a gender perspective, because it's the smaller portion of food. Meat is still the smaller portion of food in those hunting communities than all the roots and the berries and the stems that the women bring back every day.
Cool, awesome. I have to go, but I don't want to take up too much time, and I'm sure other people have things that they want to talk about.
Congratulations, Dr. Forbes.
Hi, Reggie. So great to have you here today. Thank you.
Such a pleasure and honor. To be honest, I'm struggling for words right now, because not to get too deep into the personal aspect of it, but the health actually has been a bit of a challenge of late. As a former dancer and one who had acquired a disability and had to navigate paralysis, some of the things that helped me actually regain my somatic experience was to, how do I say this? Yeah, just deepen into some of the things that you explored in your dissertation. You know, literally tangible, like real-time reclamation of this fractured, colonized body is very much. I'm actually being honest. I'm a little emotional actually after your share, because things are really coming online, like in real time right now for me. Like I actually had to undergo spine treatment a lot these past semesters, and I think where your inquiry is positioned, it really speaks to. I know you spoke to primal explorations, but as a somatic therapist, I'm now thinking about the phenomenon of transference and countertransference in a primal way, not strictly in the clinical sense, but in like a real, like, you know, imminent, lived oriented, you know, perspective. So I just want to thank you, because I did feel like a better therapist now, just after you know, listening to your presentation. And I would love to actually take time to read your dissertation, because you know, it just seems so essential.
Well, thank you, Reggie, for sharing that. And I've been aware that you've been having these sort of challenges, and I sort of look out for news for you in terms of how you're progressing. What you're referring to is really interesting, in a sense of, like, when Jake was asking his question, we were talking about retraining ourselves to think different, which, as you're talking about, reverberates in the body. And so one of the interesting things about this type of society that I value so much is Elizabeth Marshall Thomas compares their sense of memory and the way that they function with memory to elephants. So she explains, so she doesn't compare elephants to them, which I sort of also like. She compares them to elephants, and saying that They have a multi-generational collective band memory. So they have a belief that we only have the ability as each individual to know so much. They don't have the expectation that each individual has to know everything else that the band knows. But it's through the band and through they value independent personalities within that band, various functionalities in the band. Like I was, in the movie Nati, it makes a lot of jokes about Corsi, the bow hunter, and what a bow hunter is like, and the characteristics that a bow hunter inhabits versus Koroha, the running hunter. And so as a band, that memory then moves forward from generation to generation, which I do believe sits in the body. And what Matthias was talking about in terms of the disassociation, and there are actually studies being done on this right now, I think this is now finally the result of colonization and of slavery. It's these, specifically the last 200 years of forced ways of being, of these types of communities being forced to retrain themselves to think into a different paradigm. And this is why they can't associate back to those old ways at the moment, and in some instances they are reclaiming it, but I think it's visceral. It's because they were physically trained to behave and engage in the world in a different way, which then I think impacted their psychology as well.
I mean, I resonate so much, so deeply with everything you're talking about, and I think your inquiry is and the trajectory of it is positioned so beautifully to really assist in developing a truly inclusive consciousness. Like one of the misconceptions I had about somatics is that it dealt like the somatic body was only a human body, but director of the program, Don Johnson, was very quick to initiate us when he said. He took us on a hike and a retreat. He's like, look at that tree over there. Look at that bird. Those two are somatic bodies. So like when I was listening to your presentation, I was like, this is it. So I'm so interested to see where, where you may choose to take this work. Because again, it's so potent, so profound. Yeah, truly.
Well, thank you, Reggie, and I'll let you know once it's finally published and through technical review and all those nice things.
Yeah.
Real quick, Chantel, so I saw you mention Catherine Keller. What of hers did you use, and have you used her concept of the soluble self? Because I was thinking about that a lot as you were talking. I'm just curious.
Yeah, so I did not use that concept, and I did not engage her theories directly. So where Catherine Keller was really important for me is as evidence of how Deleuze in the lineage of Whitehead is being used not only in the environmental humanities, but in eco-theology and even in theology. So I was really inspired by the way that Catherine Keller used Deleuze in her work, Face of the Deep. And so
right.
That's where Catherine Keller came from. And Catherine Keller dialogues as well with Isabel Stengers, which uses Deleuze again in a totally different way. And so these sort of feminist, philosophically, scientifically philosophical thinkers, I think are doing incredibly interesting stuff with this sort of what to some is considered outdated continental philosophy, which I don't think it is at all. I just think we haven't really fully explored how to engage it.
Right, we haven't applied it, spread it wide, and what you're doing is connecting it to.
And I sort of, at the very end of my dissertation, by the way, when I was making edits, and like my last edits, I actually came across a lot more discussion where scholars were looking at Derrida and Deleuze. and comparing their ideas on ontology. And so I thought of you with that because I hadn't encountered it throughout my research. And right at the end, when Jake and Elizabeth were challenging me to go deeper on certain issues, I sort of encountered that.
Cool. Yeah. And I was thinking about him because you mentioned Haraway, and Derrida has this concept of the logic of sacrifice, and how in patriarchal hierarchical societies or non-relational ontologies, that's how we treat, human or non-human others. And so it's very oppositional to the relational ontology.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. I'm so excited. I could keep talking and I'm going to get off. So thank you. It's good to see everybody.
Thank you, Kim.
Congratulations.
You so much.
Bye.
I have to get going as well, but congratulations once again.
Thank you, Reggie. And we will chat more on these subjects.
Absolutely. Looking forward to it. Enjoy yourself. Congrats again.
Thank you. And thank you, Shmi, for all the space you've held and for facilitating today. I really appreciate it.
My pleasure. It's very meaningful for me to be present at your oral defense and to have been witness to your work unfolding, over these past couple of years. You've been so integral to my experience at CIIS, but full stop. And then how it's very exciting and fulfilling where our interests overlap and the things in me that come alive in conversation with you and in conversation with this body of work. I love hearing all of these, the conversation kind of expand after your really rich presentation, because it's just begins to hint at all of the nuances and subtleties in our ways of relating and ways of holding community and the embodied psychology of our lives.